So first of all, the first thing I want you to do, and if you all have a sheet of paper, just a blank sheet, hopefully you all have a blank sheet of paper, I want you to think about your course. Think about a course that you would like to improve. A course that you would, if you're brand new and just starting, then any of your courses, but if you have a particular one in mind that you feel is a little challenging, just not real sure where to go with it or how to make it more engaging, maybe that's the one you want to think about. At least begin to think about this semester. So, think of your specific course and think of a way you'd like to make it even better than it is, because I think, we're all good teachers here, but we can all certainly make things better. And ask yourself this question and jot down something on your paper here. What do I want them to learn? What is it that I want them to have when they finish this class? What should they have learned? So just jot down an idea or two. We'll come back to this in just a moment. Seems like an obvious question, right? But sometimes we just grab that syllabus with those objectives and just hit the ground running. So part of this is for us to be more deeply reflective as practitioners as well. So keep thinking about that and write down more things if you wish as we go along. So creating significant learning is really talking about an integrated approach to designing courses. So this is the particular idea, the big idea of this book. And in Dr. Fink's, his overall purpose is that we should be creating high-quality learning in all of our courses for all of our students, and what he calls significant learning experiences. So what does that really mean then? How would we define high-quality learning? Well, he defines it as learning when students are engaged, right? Think about that in relationship to your class. I think we all have those days where we're just really not sure what's happening out there, if they're engaged. But we have to have some indicators that students are engaged. High-quality learning occurs when student effort results in significant and lasting learning. And the learning adds value to the student's life. So those are sort of the philosophical ideas for how he defines high-quality learning. And so those are goals for us in terms of, as we think of our classes again, how can we check that they are engaged? How do we know if the learning is lasting? And how can we understand if it's adding value to our students' lives? So, one of the things that Dr. Fink does is use lots of models, lots of drawings, which I love because I'm visual in this way as well. So here's the idea of integrated course design. First of all, learning goals. Now I will say there's one area that I tweaked this a little bit. Dr. Fink says you start with situational factors, looking at those. I tend to go with the learning goals first, and then look at the situational factors. But feedback, assessment, teaching, learning activities, and learning goals, it's this synergy among all of these that really creates the deep learning. So when we talk about learning goals, let's come back to what you wrote down in terms of what I want my students to learn. Fink challenges us in his book to think broadly and deeply about what this is. That this is much more than the discrete objectives that we tend to think about sometimes, but you could ask yourself this question: 10 years from now, how do I hope my students think about, fill your subject area in there, because they were in this class? How has their thinking changed by the end of this class? And I think if we step back and start to think of it that way, that challenges us to go a little more deeply into what we are teaching than just to stay on that just kind of the surface regurgitation of facts level. But what is it? Every life should be changed through learning, right? And so what is it that we want this course to do in the life of this student? So those are big learning goals that we're thinking about. So what I tell students a lot of times, because I bring some of this into my master's curriculum class that I teach, the learning goals, that's our dreams. That's the big ideas. That's the ideal. That's where we want to go with this. So we have one foot in the ideal world, But we still have to keep the other foot in reality, and that brings us to the situational factors. So when we think about situational factors, well, we'll get to that in a moment. So when we talk about learning goals, though, now ask yourself, what do you really want them to learn? What do you really want the impact of this class to be beyond foundational, discrete pieces of knowledge? Okay? And we'll get back to the situational factors in a moment. John, do you want to step in at this point and talk about any of this so far, or should we talk to this? Okay, we'll go through this first. How many of you are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy of learning? Okay, most of us, yeah. Okay, good. Where up here do you see ideas that would mesh with Bloom? What looks familiar to you when you think about Bloom's taxonomy as contrasted with Fink's taxonomy? Foundational? Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely, foundational knowledge.
Basic
Mm-hmm.
and low on his scale.
Mm-hmm. Right, because he starts off with knowledge, and second is comprehension, yeah. And third on Bloom is application, actually, yes, so we have application there, so we have those two parts. Somebody said pretty much the right-hand side, and I would agree, because he does get some into the evaluative synthesis part of things, could be overlapping with integration there as we think about. But what I love about Fink's taxonomy is that whole left side. Because in a rich learning environment, students should be learning about themselves, how are they relating to that subject area, but also, how does that relate to others in the world around them? Caring, how can we help our students to care more deeply about the subject matter? What are the big questions? What are the big issues in each of our areas that are important? Again, it comes back to those goals. How can we help students to broaden their ideas of what they value? Or, in music, I tell students, you don't have to love it, but let's respect the work that goes into different genres and styles. And how can we expand then, that's what music appreciation class or art appreciation class, and again, expanding students' understanding of certain subject areas in ways that help them to at least value what goes into that, and hopefully, spur more interest, but then also learning how to learn. What do they learn about themselves? How do they learn about what it means to research and do inquiry in a particular subject area? So, when we're thinking about our goals for our students, we really want to, for an entire course, over an entire semester, we really want to tick all of these areas in terms of thinking, what can our students do? So now I'm going to ask John to talk about how he's made meaning for some of this in terms of the course that he's working
Sure. If it's poster child, it's only in the sense that I'm trying this out. So it's just real life example. I don't pretend like any of the syllabi that I'm working on are model in the sense that it's gotten it perfectly. It's just real life. It's someone really trying to do it with real classes. So I think that's the idea. And I'll say I'm not the kind of person to get turned on by something like this. I wasn't. I'm not that kind of a teacher. This is the kind of thing that usually makes me go, yeah, right. But man, I took the workshop with the D. Pincus Associates. I went through it, and boy, did it convict me. I, for a long time, was kind of skating on. I thought I was a pretty good teacher, but I was skating on two things: knowledge of content, I knew my stuff, and personality in the classroom. That was pretty much the extent of my approach to pedagogy. Just be alive in the classroom and know your stuff. And when it came to designing syllabi, I was what a lot of us are, which is, okay, what am I going to do? Let's crack open the book, go through the table of contents, and there's my class. And this opened my eyes to really much better approaches. So I'll just sort of go in the same order she did and just give an example of some of my courses. One course in particular that I'm working on using D. Fink is a class I teach once a year. It's called Form and Analysis. And what I've given you a handout with some of the things that I'm working on. This is not a finished syllabus. This is a work in progress. But it'll cover some of these things. And then another course, I'm thinking about music composition, how to teach music composition, especially an introductory class. How would I do that based on this? And I'm thinking in particular, an individual lesson, private or at school, or a class. What would this have to do with it? And the reason those two courses seem relevant is they're very contrasting. The Form and Analysis class is your kind of knowledge, very foundational knowledge kind of centered class. The composition is an extremely creative application sort of class. So how do these work? With the and it started, as she says, with this big dream. What do you want them to learn about? And what do you want them to learn? And if you had asked me some time ago what I want them to learn, it would have been very basic. I want them to learn the stuff I'm going to teach them. That's what I want them to learn. And at the end of the semester, I want them to have learned whatever I taught them, which was very narrow, and most of it was very foundational knowledge. Basically, my whole realm tended to be here and a little bit there. Virtually nothing here, and then probably some things there. But the thing was, when I was pressed on, if you imagine 3 years from now, the student has graduated. They've graduated and they've moved on. What's the thing that they got from your class at that point in time? What's the real thing that you care most about? You want them to remember, an ideal student. When pressed in that, it was surprising to me and to a lot of people how much of this stuff enters the picture. What do I want them? For Form and Analysis, I don't really want, most of all, that they will remember every term and concept that I've given them. But I want them to care a lot about the subject. With Form and Analysis, form and music form is what makes a work a whole and how do the parts relate to it and that kind of thing. I don't particularly care if they can remember all the terms for the classifications for binary form. What I do want them, I want them 3 years, 5 years from now to really care deeply about form and music. I want that to be part of it. But that was not in my syllabus. It didn't have anything to do with how I designed the course. It just wasn't there. It's something I really wanted that wasn't in my course. Okay, I'll give you an example. For composition, here's my new dream for, and this is, again, this is a hypothetical course. A hypothetical course on an introduction to composition, music composition. What's my big dream? My big dream is when my students have finished this course, I hope that they will be able to compose musical works from start to finish, but also that they have the desire and ability to continually develop their skill by studying the composition techniques of others and assimilating what they've learned. I hope that they will understand the manifold ways in which new music may be used to benefit others, and will seek out occasions in their own communities to compose and produce new music for others, adapting their style and techniques to the requirements of the situation. That's a much bigger dream than I would have imagined, because I've had a lot of these things kind of run through my mind. That's the big dream, and that's where I started. Then there's situational factors. So for composition, what are the situational factors that are going to kind of, in some ways, put a wet blanket on the dream, but in other ways, set parameters for my course that actually enable me to move forward? For that, it depends on the context. Are the individual lessons? That's a situational factor. What's the nature of the subject? It's creative and divergent. For composition, there is no professional consensus on what is taught, so that's kind of a situational factor. Some things are matters of accreditation. Some things are, oh, thank you. Some courses, you've got to teach this for that course. That's a situational factor. What's expected out of a course like this? Situational factor, okay. The specific context of the teacher and learner. What's the actual location? Is this going to be an online course? Is this going to be individual? Are you going to have how many times a week do you meet? All of those are factors that go into affect your big dream. Which is why Linda said sometimes it's better to start with the dream and then go to situational factors, because, but they all work together, they kind of inform one another. Nature of the subject, characteristics of learners. Yeah, the learners, knowing about your students. Are these students going to be people who have some foundation in what we're doing, or are we starting from scratch? That's situational factors. And then characteristics of the teacher. Spending time, I was taught to spend time reflecting as well as I could on actually my own situation. Do I actually know as much as I think I do about this? Am I prepared? Am I going to be basically running a chapter ahead of the students? What are all the factors that are important? Do I need to get other help? What is my style? Am I, my style of teaching, how is that going to inform and impact my dream? And then, after the big dream, should I do the learning goals? Or should I wait?
Why don't you talk about your learning goals?
So, then, after the dream, you've got to come up with, okay, then, here's the big picture, the big dream I want, and what are the particular goals, the outcomes that I want for my students? Now, we were used to doing this on a syllabus, but I never quite knew what I was doing with those general outcomes, specific outcomes, but they plug right in there nicely. But, so for formative analysis, again, this is a work in progress. I kind of resisted the idea that you have to have all the categories. I said, well, but different classes are different. Why do I need all the classes? And she'll probably talk about why, and he even has a nice little picture to show you why he thinks having something about all six categories actually really is kind of important. Sometimes it's a struggle to come up with it. So here's what I came up with for my formative analysis class. This is so far. For foundational knowledge, students will be able to describe in writing, using professional terms, the typical formal processes of several important genres. Okay? I kept it a little bit vague, several important genres, but so choosing sonata, concerto, what are the processes involved in that? So that's the foundational knowledge to me. Those are the things I want them to come back and I want to do some backward assessing. I want to say, at the end of the class, tell me these terms, tell me these processes, did you get that? Then application, students will be able to compare compare the form of contrasting musical examples. How can they take that foundational knowledge and put it into use? Well, I want them, there's a lot of ways they can do that, but the way that I chose is I want them to take two different things, and I want them to be able to express the difference and the similarity between those formal processes. If they can do that, they show me they can apply their knowledge, and I think I can work on that a little bit better, but that's where I am now. Integration, students will be able to explain in writing the philosophical problems inherent in the study of form. There's a big problem with studying musical form. It's a real problem. I want them to use what they've learned in any of their other classes, and I want to use as much as they can to inform, go behind the curtain and say, well, what is this whole thing? How are we studying musical form? What is this about? There's all kinds of issues there. Then the human dimension, two things, self and others. I want them to be able to examine their progress in perceiving musical form and in perceiving form musical experiences. I want them to be able to start the class and have some level of self-awareness. Do I even care about form? When I go to a concert, are my conversations about the form? And track that level and see, I want them to be aware, at the end of the course or later on, do they sense in themselves a progress in their perception of musical form? So I want them to have some self-awareness there. Then others, I want them to be able to interpret music for their own instruments in ways that enable listeners to follow the form most easily. Most of the students in this class are performing musicians. That's also application really, but I want them, this was, you can tell I was sort of trying to figure out, well, what am I going to do here? But that's one. I want them to be able to communicate to others form through their performance. Finally, or no, not quite finally, on the back, caring. That's not caring like caring and sharing. That's caring like apathy versus deep interest. Students will be more interested in considerations of form when they evaluate music. That's a lofty goal. I want them to finish the class and actually now be interested in the conversation. And then learning how to learn, students will be able to articulate a strategy for discovering form in music that they haven't encountered before. I'll end there, but key thing is that all of these goals in the design of this, all of these goals happened before I even thought about content, textbook, subjects. There's no time plan yet. This is all just, this is what I want students to get out of the class.
Thanks, John. So, I'll just back up one slide here. So this is what John mentioned. You can see here, again, another diagram. Do we really need to have all the components present? Well, no. The police aren't going to, the syllabus police aren't going to be necessarily checking for that. But our students will miss out if we don't find ways. And I think it's important to challenge ourselves. Some classes, it is hard to identify these things, but if we can't do it, we should step back and think about perhaps maybe should that whole class be rethought in some way then? Is there something? Because hopefully these elements should be a part of any teaching and learning context in the grand scheme. Every class period, every unit doesn't have to have this, but by the end of a semester, students should have had opportunities to engage in these. And as he points out, it's when we have all of this happening, again, it's that synergy, all of it working together, the integrated course design, when we make all of these parts work together, that we get the significant learning. Again, and one of the things I love about this, and if you're in education, you know it sounds very similar to understanding by design, some of you may be familiar with that, but it's that idea that all of our planning links back to those big goals. So we're not kind of shooting in the dark. It's like, okay, in this topic, I think this would be good, and I'll teach them this, and I'll teach them this, and I'll teach them this, and they'll have these pockets of knowledge. But here, everything, we keep coming back to that big goal. How does the learning to learn relate to our big goal? How does application relate to our big goal? That way, everything is moving toward that same point, and it just creates this natural integration. So the big goal is our that's the glue. That's the glue that holds it all together. So, thinking about this now, let me go back to this. Okay, so let's go back to your class. And I'm going to challenge you now to see if you can come up with a learning goal of some kind for your class that is not foundational knowledge or application. You can't use those two. But think in those other areas, try to do two of the other four and see if you can come up with something that you feel would appropriately help you to start getting your students toward that big goal in these other areas. So we'll just take a minute or two and then I'll have a little sharing see what you came up with. Okay, I'm sure some of you are still thinking and writing, but let's just, anybody willing to share something you did?
I'll share.
Okay, great.
I'm teaching health assessment in nursing, which is learning how to use your stethoscope, which is really exciting. And so, but to develop a confidence approaching the bedside and touching strangers when they're developing their Petitot assessment.
Okay.
Performing a Petitot assessment.
All right, excellent. And did you put that in the?
I put it in caring.
Caring, yeah.
Caring or meta-human connection.
And that's a great example of the fact that as much as we want to categorize and put things in, there are gray areas, some of these will hit 2 or 3 areas at one time. And that's okay. That is perfectly fine. So, yeah, I can see where that would be quite a goal. I would be one of those freaking out, so, yeah. Somebody else? Okay.
In teaching the art history for the human dimension, with students will learn to examine how they relate to the visual environment, as far as how they personally relate to what they're seeing.
That's great. I mean, we could take that same one and pop it in music appreciation, how they relate to their oral environment, to the sound environment around us. Yeah, excellent, excellent. Somebody else, did anybody do learning how to learn?
I did.
Okay.
Linda and I teach a class together, and I was saying that I want my students to sort of instinctively start searching for information when we bring up a composer they've never heard of. That would thrill me if they all just, because we're in a computer lab, and if we said, X composer, and they all went, oh, I didn't, and started searching for information about that composer, that would thrill me.
I think we both would be doing a happy dance at that point in time, that would be wonderful.
To see them have
Yeah.
that desire, that for inquiry
Yeah.
is, I think, really important.
Absolutely. Anybody have another one you wanna share, something a little on a different track or different line here?
I did mine in the area of caring as well, and this relates to the course of teaching methods and materials for teaching music in elementary school. So many of the students I have visualize themselves to be conductors of advanced high school programs. And so they don't, oh, you're like, so they don't always see themselves in the elementary music classroom, nor do they value the importance of that role. So a focus would be to develop greater interest and value in realizing the importance of that.
Yeah, absolutely. When you do the workshop, the Think workshop, you do, by the end of the time, you come with a course in mind. And what we're doing is like putting one toe in the water of what you actually do there over the course of a few days. But the course I did was for, again, a music class, but it's a secondary general methods. And here is where I take those same people who think they're going to be the next great conductors and help them to understand that they may be teaching a music appreciation class in high school to ninth graders who could care less. Or what can they do with that then? And to help them expand their idea of what music education is beyond the fact that of choirs. But so thinking about, thinking about that class, if they were challenged, if they were put in a position where they said, you have to teach a history of rock class this semester. Okay, well then, so I'm trying to focus on caring, and again, it's that idea of interests and values, because some of our students, believe it or not, don't really value rock music. Or find interest in it and realize that you can still teach all the musical concepts you want through that particular venue. So they're learning about themselves, it's the caring and so on too. So I think, it's that idea of, we all believe very passionately in what we're teaching. How can we help our students to develop a little bit of that, connect to that in some way, is that caring part. So that's one I think that really, throughout this process, keeps coming back and hitting me, because if students are interested, if they value, they will be curious. And that's what spurs ongoing learning, right? If we're curious about something, we're out there finding out more about it. Okay, so significant learning, then we have that occurring. So the situational factors, and again, in terms, John covered these very well. In terms of your class, then, what are some of the things that could impact that? Is your class primarily foundational? And, many of the nursing courses, the initial ones, they have to memorize certain things. They have to understand certain procedures. I want them to understand certain procedures. But other classes are very philosophical, very theoretical. So all of those kinds of contextual things will have an impact on how we think about this. And it's important to take that into consideration as we design our learning goals. Now, I love what John said too. All of this happens before we ever get to the point of thinking about, what am I doing on day 3 of this class, and what's on my syllabus, and so on. So the next big question we ask ourselves in this overall course design, first of all, is what do I want them to know? What are these big learning goals? What's going to impact that, the situational factors? The next question we should ask ourselves is, how am I going to know that they know? A lot of times we want to go right from the learning goals to, okay, here's a great idea, and here's another activity, and here's another activity. But that's later. What we have to ask ourselves first is, how am I going to know? What are they going to do to demonstrate to me that they understand, that they are nearing, the culmination of this big goal that I have put out for them? So the idea of assessment and feedback is so critical here. So we want to think about what are the kind of rich learning experiences we can design for them. But along with that, how we do our assessment and feedback is so critical and so important as well. What we really want to design are, when we think about how am I going to know, we want forward-looking assessment activities. What does that mean to you when you hear that term, forward-looking? How would you think about that?
How are you gonna use this in the future? How are you actually gonna implement this whenever you're out of school and living your life?
Yeah, absolutely. You can think of it from the student's perspective in that way. Yes, absolutely. In terms of the teacher, how would you think about yourself? How do you think about forward-looking assessment? It's similar to what many of you probably know as formative assessment, right? Where your assessments are designed in such a way that they inform you, they give you information about, all right, do they understand? Nope, okay, that means I need to reteach this part of it, or I need to think of another strategy for this, or they've got this down cold, it's time to move on. But what the assessment does is inform you as a teacher as to where they are, and that helps you to formulate your plans for what the next step is in that class then. So it's forward-looking in terms of providing direction to you as the teacher as to where you're going to go next with those assessments and so on. So that's something to think about in terms of the assessment activities or the assessment. I'm going to spend a lot of time on building a rubric. I know that we have many resident gurus here, and Rachel did a session earlier today, Rachel Renaissance, on rubrics, and I'm sure many of you have dealt with that. But again, that's something that provides us flexibility. It helps communicate to the students what some of our concrete expectations are when we're using rubrics. But we'll move on from that. Self-assessment is something John touched on too, and asking the students to reflect on their own learning is absolutely critical. We can do and do and do, but if we don't stop and think about what we just did, it's hard to say we really learned anything. And helping students to own their progress through the course is so empowering for them. And, sometimes we ourselves have to step back and think about, well, what have I just gained through this particular experience? But it's very important to have those kinds of opportunities for our students to be able to do that. And to help them understand, again, even helping them understand the value of this, valuing and caring even in terms of the assessments. John, did you have particular things that you were going to have your students do in terms of the self-assessment? You mentioned one, but.
There were,
a few things.
that's something we're doing in a lot of classes now.
Mhm.
I mean, that's, it just brought to my awareness how little I did of that. Maybe I'll wait until we're done with the assessment stuff overall.
Okay, yep. So self-assessment, and then, here's one of, Dr. Fink's, little acronyms, he calls it fidelity feedback. And this, it's just kind of, every time I look at this, DeEtte will understand this. The feedback should be frequent for students. Here's the one, immediate. Discriminating. By discriminating, he means, do the students understand that their level of work is adequate, as opposed to, do they understand what excellent would look like? Do they understand what adequate is? Do they understand what poor means? So do they have an idea of the different levels of expectations? Are they able to see the way that you are making discriminations in the document itself? And then loving, and I like that too. That's certainly in the nature of things. It certainly fits our nature and mission here to help many of our students. But it's this idea of frequent, immediate, and John and I were talking about this morning. You should all have a conversation about teaching and learning every Friday morning. It's a great way to start the day. So John and I were theoretically touching base on this, but we got into a lot of other things this morning. But this idea of frequent and immediate, if we let our students slide around and the first feedback they get is their grade on their midterm test, we have done them a disservice because they have had no indication from us of what kind of progress, and we've done ourselves a disservice because we have no idea if they're getting anything that we're doing, that we're working with. The idea of immediate, we are all wired this way, right? If I did something today and somebody is looking over my shoulder and talking to me about it, critiquing, I mean, I get it. If it comes tomorrow, yeah, I can if it comes a week from today, I don't necessarily remember what I was thinking when I wrote that paragraph. Right? I mean, can you see some of your students in that situation? And yet, I understand our lives, and I am talking to me right now because that immediate part is a challenge. But the class we teach, we have writing projects every week, and we both grade them concurrently, so it's interesting. So these are important ideas that Fink wants us to think about too. Now, in terms of those goals, in terms of the learning goals we've established, then what kinds of assessments can we design? What kinds of building the rubric helps us think about what's the criteria of those assessments? And all of this is helping us to think, are we really, again, back to the main goal, are we really helping our students progress towards that big idea, that big goal we have? So what are effective teaching learning activities then? You contrast passive learning, which is predominantly receiving information, just, direct instruction, I'm sitting here blank slate receiving, and as opposed to active learning, which involves both experience, where we have students do, and observing is active learning too. It can be if it's structured appropriately. It should be active learning. And also then the reflective dialogue with self and with others, and I love that with self too. We all have these internal conversations, right? But the journaling, reflective journaling, and this is going to be a part of our QEP work, and I should have said that from the very beginning. All of this ties in very much with our QEP work and thinking about the integrative ideas here. But dialogue with self. We all have these conversations in our head as we're learning something. Wow, that's just like, yeah, I remember when, but the idea of writing things down too, the self-assessments, and with others. Collaboration is huge in the ideas of active learning, getting them to talk to others. There are very few things they will do after they leave college that they will do in complete isolation, right? So where better to be learning how to be intentional, in-depth thinkers and collaborators than in the context of our classes and dealing with our course material. So he describes holistic, this whole idea of active learning. Here's another one of his diagrams. So experiences of doing, observing. The more that they can be actual experiences or simulations of actual experiences, that's where we really start to get into what he calls rich, deep learning experiences. Reflection about subject and learning processes, information and ideas, all of this is part of the active learning. In the class that I teach that I mentioned, where I want them to be thinking more broadly about music ed, one of my goals is to have them complete an assignment where they have to write a justification for a new course they want to introduce into the curriculum, an atypical course, and they go out to Walker Valley every Thursday morning to observe. I am going to work with those teachers there where they will have to present that to those teachers as if they were in a school situation, presenting it to a principal wanting to get input. So where they have to actually dialogue with practitioners in the field and justify something as if they would to a principal. So the actual experience in an actual context, the more we can move our students toward that, the deeper and richer those learning experiences can be, and the more pieces we can tie together as well. Do you want to talk about anything here so far? Yeah, okay, yeah.
Going a little bit back to assessment, one of the things that I learned through working through this process is that I have I've had very few methods of assessment, totally inadequate to the task. I needed to think hard and be far more creative about the ways I assess. How do you assess caring? How do you assess all those things? All of my assessments were backward looking. I was your typical your typical, not too long ago out of school. I never took a class on designing a syllabus. I'm teaching class, and now I'm basically giving content and then backward looking assessment. I'm saying, did you learn what I just taught you? Testing. So I had to be really creative, and I'm still working on it. If you look through, I won't read them, but you look through my assessments for each of those categories, they need a lot of work. I need a lot of work there. I've got to think of better ways. And doing that is actually really exciting to me. It's actually a lot of fun to try to come up with ways. To try to come up with ways of assessment that are forward-looking, that make the students excited to do them. I would love to give my students all the assessments to serve both the purpose of me being able to evaluate and all that, but also give them assessments where they say, that's what I want to do. That's exactly why I'm taking the class. And it's kind of fun to come up with those things. Can we go back a couple slides? So, well, maybe one more. One more forward. I was thinking about this, and this was, one of the greatest teachers ever is Socrates, and this is how he taught. When you think it was always in a group. He's not telling his pupils a bunch of stuff. He is helping them to figure things out in the context of a group, letting them interact with each other often. Everybody around is watching this thing happen, so I really like that. But so much of my teaching has always been that. But with assessment, fidelity, feedback, maybe one more backwards. Sure. This has just revolutionized stuff for me. Well, not revolutionized, it's just made me, once again, I need to go back and I need to do a lot of work. So in one of my other classes where this is coming into a big play is music theory. And so this year, I'm making a lot of changes to my assessments in music theory. One of the problems, music theory is a heavy workload kind of class. Every class there's an assignment. And that means I get a pile of assignments. Every class period. And when you have multiple sections of this, anybody who teaches those kinds of classes, it means you have a stream of assignments, constant. And these are, especially the upper levels of theory, these are things that are meticulous grading. My previous approach, mark everything that's wrong with it with an X. And you guys are probably much better teachers than I. You probably think, well, duh. But there I go. Everything, no, this one's wrong. I correct it, hand it back. That's the approach. Problems with that were way too time consuming. Every year, one of the things on my reviews, sure would be nice to get my homework back in a more timely fashion. Okay, this year I'm really going to do it. And it wasn't a matter of me trying harder to get the assignment. It was impossible. You do the math of how many minutes do I spend on one sheet of music theory? Just impossible. So I needed a way to have more time-efficient grading, but also the other problem with that is a student gets back a piece of paper that has a bunch of red X's on it, and it's overwhelming, and they throw it away. Not to mention what she said, that they got it a week later, and so they forgot what they were doing. They don't remember their thinking process if a week later. And they don't remember it, so this goes directly in the trash. So my grading, because of that, my grading was infrequent. No, it was frequent. That was no problem. It's always frequent because they're always doing it. But it was not my feedback. My feedback was not frequent. My feedback would come in a pile. Here's a bunch of assignments. Sorry it took you so long. Here's your pile of assignments. You have to get back to me. It wasn't frequent. The feedback wasn't. The assignments were frequent. The feedback wasn't. The feedback was not immediate. Discriminating. I wasn't really. It wasn't really showing them what is high quality work because they were just all. It was just all showing bad quality work indiscriminately, and it wasn't loving because I wasn't. All I was doing was saying, "This is all the stuff you got wrong." What I'm going to do now. What I'm going to do now is, in order to give all that kind of feedback, one, I'm not going to tell them everything they got wrong. I'm going to find out what is the essence of this assignment and what is one thing that if I write, and I'm not going to write X's, I'm going to write a note on their assignment. I'm going to say, I think this was a great job. I think what you can focus on is resolving the leading tone. They may have gotten 20 things wrong. I want them to read my note that says resolve the leading tone. It's one thing. It'll take me far less time. I'll get it back to them in the next class period. And then they're going to respond to that. And so in my homework policy, they're also going to have to respond. It gives them an opportunity to improve what they just did. And so this feedback is a big thing. And then what was the next thing? Okay, so on your columns, the assessment, activities, that was the thing after the learning goals that I came up with, and I won't read them. And it was after that that I had to come up with, okay, then, here's all the ways I'm gonna know that they did the goals, but how do I bring them to that point? Those are my learning activities. And what I realized was, I don't have to grade every learning activity. If the students understand from the beginning that all of these things that I'm asking them to do and that we're doing together are tied to these forward-looking assessments, they're perfectly willing to do these activities. Perfectly willing. I don't have to give them a grade. I need to give them loving feedback. I need to guide them, but I don't need to spend a lot of time coming up with ways to grade every learning activity. This is all tied to a goal that they really want to buy into, hopefully. So these learning activities, I don't even have to worry about how I'm going to assess the learning activities. I just need to make sure that I design activities that are going to help them get to an assessment. And that assessment is going to be something that's forward-looking and that they want to achieve. And those are tied to the learning outcomes that I said, these are the important things that I want the students to come away with, which is all coming out of the big dream I had for them. Theoretically, if that works, that kind of backward design, starting with a big dream, working toward those, if that's gonna work out for me, with all those categories, it should be a good class, whether I have a great personality in the classroom or not.
But you do, and just add that on top of everything else. So, just quickly wrapping up then, so, then it's this idea of integrating these components we've talked about, the learning goals, the teaching activities, the feedback and assessment. When it's all put together, as John just described, we have our educative assessments, the active learning, significant learning occurs. So, then the final steps in his book, the final points that he emphasizes is to then create, at that point, a thematic structure for the course. How are you going to tie it all together? How are you going to order all of this? What instructional strategies will you as the teacher use? Active learning strategies, problem-based learning strategies, and so on. So this is where you start to think about those strategies. Once you have that in place, you create your overall learning plan of all of these activities. That's kind of your course calendar. See how long it is before I get to the course calendar instead of starting with week 1's chapter 1? And then, at the very end, additional considerations. Then you put the grading into it. Identify and troubleshoot possible problems. Where are the holes in this? Where are the points where you think, oh, I really don't know about this? Try to predict. And look, oh my goodness, about 15 points that he has. Number 14 is develop a syllabus. But you do that once you have this big picture in mind that again, it's just this inverted pyramid, or it's this pyramid where it comes back to the big goal at the top. And then, of course, for all of us, we need to have some kind of intentional way of getting feedback for ourselves about that course. We have course evaluations, student course evaluations here, but there might be other things we want to consider ourselves too in terms of, bringing in peers to help give us feedback and some of those kinds of things. But as I said, if you're new and you haven't had a chance to really look at, this is the book, and again, this was sipping water from a fire hose today in relationship to this book, because there's so much rich material in here, and all of the things we've talked about are really thoroughly delved into in depth here. John had mentioned another one that I want to look at. It's effective grading, I think is the name of it. Effective grading that helps give us, I think, some more good input and insights into that part of the assessment. But I hope we can all focus on, just rethinking about what are those. How do we want to? It's all about changing lives, right? So if we want to change life, what is it that we want for our students? How do we want them to have changed because of their interaction with the subject matter in our courses? And I think that's kind of the compelling question for all of this. So there's Trish McClung is another person who on campus who has done the faith workshop. Trevor Milliron.
Donna did it
Donna?
online.
Yeah,
There
yeah.
are 2 people who did it online, I can't remember.
Yeah, so there are others, and hopefully this is something that we'll continue